Sometimes the smallest moment is the one that rewrites your entire life. I wasn't supposed to get involved that night. Not in a place like that. Not with people like them. I just wanted a quiet dinner after a 12-hour shift. Something simple, something normal. But the second I stepped into that restaurant, I felt it. The kind of tension that doesn't belong in a room filled with soft jazz and overpriced wine. The kind that sits heavy in your chest like a warning you can't explain. I remember adjusting my coat, telling myself I was imagining things, until I saw her. The waitress, maybe early 20s, blonde hair pulled too tight into a bun, her hands trembling as she held a tray that wasn't even that heavy. And the man in front of her, loud, polished, the kind of rich that doesn't ask twice, his voice cutting through the room like it owned the space. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" he said, not even lowering his tone, and nobody moved. Not the manager, not the couples pretending to focus on their meals, not even the bartender who clearly heard every word. They all chose silence, the safe kind, the kind that keeps your life uncomplicated. And I told myself to do the same. I really did. I picked up my menu, tried to focus on the prices, on anything else. But then I saw her fingers tighten around the edge of the tray, saw the way her lips pressed together like she was trying not to cry. And something inside me refused to stay quiet. My heart started pounding, fast, louder than the music, louder than logic. I could feel that familiar argument in my head. Stay out of it. Emily, it's not your business. But then he leaned closer to her, just enough to make her step back, and that was it. That was the moment everything shifted. I stood up before I even realized I was doing it. The chair scraping against the floor louder than I intended, every head turning, and suddenly, I was part of the scene I tried to avoid. She said, "Stop." I heard myself say, my voice steadier than I felt. The words simple, but they landed. The man turned to me slowly, like I had just interrupted something important, his eyes scanning me, sizing me up, and for a second, doubt crept in. Maybe I had crossed a line I didn't understand. Maybe I should sit back down, apologize, disappear, but I didn't. I held his gaze, even as my pulse raced in my ears. The room went quiet, unnaturally quiet, like something unseen had just entered the conversation. And that's when I felt it. Not heard, not seen, just felt. A shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Like the entire restaurant had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. I didn't know why yet, didn't know who, but something, or someone, had just decided this moment mattered, and I had no idea what I had just stepped into. The man's expression shifted, not into anger, not into embarrassment, but into something colder, something calculating, like he was deciding whether I was worth the effort of responding to. And for a brief second, I thought he might laugh it off, brush me aside like an inconvenience. But he did not. He straightened slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with deliberate precision, his attention fully on me now. And the waitress, she had frozen beside him, her tray still in her hands, her eyes darting between us like she was caught in a storm she never asked for. "You should sit down," he said, his voice lower this time, controlled, the kind of tone people use when they are used to being obeyed. And I felt it. That pressure, that unspoken expectation that I would back down, that everyone always did. But my feet stayed planted, even as my fingers curled slightly at my sides. Enough to catch a glimpse of the man rising from a table near the back. A table I had not even noticed before, and somehow that felt wrong, because everything about him demanded attention. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, dressed in a dark suit that fit like it had been made specifically for him. His posture relaxed but precise, every movement controlled, and yet it was not his appearance that held the room. It was the reaction to him, the way people subtly stepped aside without being asked, the way staff straightened, the way even the man in front of me seemed to hesitate for the first time, just a fraction, but enough to notice. The new arrival did not rush, did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward, each step measured, until he was close enough that I could see his eyes, dark, steady, observant, taking in everything at once, the broken rhythm of the moment, the waitress on the edge of tears, the man who had been so confident seconds ago, and then me. And when his gaze landed on me, it lingered, not dismissive, not surprised, just interested, like he had found something unexpected in a place he thought he understood completely. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, and his voice was calm. Newcomer, as if searching for confirmation of what he already suspected, the kind of recognition that does not need to be said out loud, the kind that travels through a room faster than words ever could. And the waitress beside him. She finally lowered the tray, her hands shaking less now, not because she felt safe yet, but because something had shifted in her favor, something she could not name but clearly felt. And I stood there, caught in the middle of it all, my pulse still racing my mind, trying to piece together why this man, this stranger, had changed everything just by stepping closer. "It is nothing," the man finally said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Just a misunderstanding." And the way he said it, the way he softened his tone, it was not for me. It was for him, for the man now standing between us and the rest of the world. And that was when I understood, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that this was not an equal conversation anymore. The balance had tipped completely. The newcomer tilted his head slightly, considering, his gaze moving from the man to the waitress, then back to me, like he was reading a story written in silence. "A misunderstanding does not usually leave someone looking like that," he said, his voice still calm. But there was something underneath it now, something sharper, not anger, not even frustration, just certainty. The kind that does not need to raise its volume to be heard. The man beside the waitress let out a small laugh, too quick, too forced. "I think we are done here," he said, reaching for his coat as if he had suddenly remembered somewhere else he needed to be. And no one stopped him. No one needed to. Because it was clear that whatever control he thought he had was already gone, completely. And as he stepped away, as he moved toward the exit with a pace that tried to look casual but failed, the room slowly exhaled. Conversations returning in hushed tones, glasses lifted again, but not quite the same as before, not quite as loud. Because everyone knew something had just happened, something that did not belong to them. And I felt it too. That lingering weight in the air, that invisible line I had crossed without understanding the consequences. I turned slightly, intending to return to my seat, to step out of whatever this was. But I did not make it far, because his voice stopped me. "You," he said, not loudly, but directly, and I froze. Every instinct telling me to keep walking, to pretend I had not heard. But I turned anyway, slowly, meeting his gaze again, and this time it was different. Not just observant, not just curious, but focused, entirely on me, like the rest of the room had faded into something irrelevant. "Why did you do that?" he asked, and it was not an accusation, not exactly, but it carried weight, the kind of question that expects a real answer, not something polite or rehearsed. And I swallowed, suddenly aware of how dry my throat felt, of how exposed I was under that steady attention. "Because no one else was going to," I said, the words coming out softer than I intended, but still firm, still mine. And for a second, nothing happened. He simply watched me, like he was measuring something I could not see. And then, just barely, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close, something rare. "That is usually how it starts," he said quietly, and the way he said it made my chest tighten. Not from fear exactly, but from the sense that I had just stepped into something that had already been set in motion long before I arrived, and somehow, without realizing it, I had become part of it. I should have walked away right then. I felt it in the way my chest tightened, in the way the air around him seemed heavier than anywhere else in the room, like standing too close to something you do not fully understand but know instinctively could change everything. And yet I stayed, because something in his question, in the way he asked it, made it impossible to pretend this was over, impossible to go back to being just another person at another table. I held his gaze longer than I probably should have, aware of every second stretching between us, aware that people were still watching even if they pretended not to. "That is usually how what starts?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but steady, and for a moment he did not answer, his eyes studying me like he was deciding how much I deserved to know, or how much I could handle. I could not tell which. Then he took a small step closer, not invading, not threatening, just enough to shift the space between us into something more intentional. "Problems," he said simply, and there was no humor in it, no exaggeration, just a statement that felt far more real than I wanted it to be. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself, trying to remind myself that this was still just a restaurant, Still just a night that was supposed to end like any other. But nothing about it felt normal anymore. Not the way the staff avoided looking directly at him. Not the way the manager had suddenly appeared at a distance, watching but not intervening. Not even the way the waitress now stood a few steps back, her shoulders slightly straighter, her fear replaced by something fragile but growing, relief. She did not deserve that, I said, glancing briefly toward the waitress before, looking back at him. And this time, something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, like a flicker of something human beneath the control. No, he agreed, and the word landed heavier than I expected, because it was not just agreement, it was acknowledgement, the kind that carries weight, the kind that suggests he had already decided that much before I ever spoke. Silence settled again. Not uncomfortable, not exactly, but charged, like something unfinished still, lingered between us. And then he did something unexpected. He turned slightly, his attention shifting past me for a brief second, and I followed his gaze instinctively, noticing two men near the entrance, dressed similarly to him, not identical, but close enough to belong to the same world. They were not watching openly, but they were aware, alert in a way that did not belong in a place like this. And when I looked back at him, I understood just enough to feel the edge of it, whatever this was. Whatever world he came from, it did not stop at the door. It came with him, always. You should be careful, he said, his voice lower now, meant only for me. And something about that made my pulse quicken. Again, not because it sounded like a threat, but because it did not. It sounded like a warning, genuine and unfiltered, and that made it more unsettling than anything else. I frowned slightly. Careful of what? I asked, and for the first time, he paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was choosing whether to give it to me, his gaze steady, unwavering, like he was measuring the cost of honesty, of being the kind of person who does not look away, he said finally, and the way he said it made something inside me shift, because it was not criticism, it was recognition, the kind that feels like being seen too clearly by someone you just met, and before I could respond, before I could ask anything else, he stepped back, just slightly, enough to create distance again, enough to remind me that whatever moment had just passed between us was not something I controlled. Enjoy your dinner, Emily, he added, and the sound of my name in his voice stopped everything for a split second, my thoughts, my breath, the fragile sense of normal I had been trying to hold on to, because I had never told him my name. And in that moment, I realized something that made the room feel smaller, not safer. I had stepped into his world the second I stood up, but he had already known exactly who I was. For a second, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe the noise of the room or the rush of adrenaline had twisted something simple into something it was not. But the way he said it, calm, certain, like it had always been obvious, left no room for doubt. He knew my name, and I had never told him, not to him, not to anyone in this room. My throat tightened slightly as I watched him step back toward his table, the distance between us returning, but it did not feel like distance anymore, not really, because whatever line had been crossed was not something that could be undone by a few feet of space. I stood there longer than I should have, my thoughts catching up in uneven pieces, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he overheard someone. Maybe I had said it without realizing, but none of it felt right. None of it matched the certainty in his voice, the kind of certainty that came from knowing, not guessing. Emily. The waitress's voice pulled me back, soft, hesitant, like she was not sure if she was allowed to speak to me. I turned to her, noticing for the first time how young she looked up close, how her eyes were still a little red but steadier now. Are you okay? I asked, and she nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, thank you, she said, her fingers twisting together in front of her. No one ever. People usually just look away. Her words trailed off, and I felt that familiar weight settle again, the one that had made me stand up in the first place. You do not have to thank me, I said quietly, but even as I said it, I knew that was not entirely true, because moments like that, moments where someone chooses not to stay silent, they mattered more than we like to admit. She gave me a small smile, uncertain but real, before glancing past me, toward him, and I did the same without thinking. He was already seated again, as if nothing had happened, as if he had never stood in the center of the room and shifted everything with a single question. But the illusion did not hold, not completely, because the people around him still moved differently, still spoke a little softer, still watched him when they thought he would not notice, and the two men near the entrance had not left, their presence quiet but constant, like a reminder that whatever normal looked like here, it had limits. Do you know him? The waitress asked carefully, her voice dropping even lower, and I shook my head immediately. Maybe too quickly. No, I said, and the word felt both true and incomplete at the same time, because I did not know him, not really, but he knew me, and that changed things in a way I could not ignore. She nodded, though I could tell she did not fully believe it, or maybe she just did not understand what it meant. I was not sure I did either. Well, whatever that was, she added, glancing again toward his table. It does not usually happen like that. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. I figured. I replied, and for a moment we just stood there, two people trying to make sense of something that did not fit into our version of reality. You should go back to your table, she said after a second, her voice a little steadier now. I will be fine. And I hesitated, not because I did not believe her, but because leaving felt different now, like stepping away from something unfinished, something that had not fully revealed itself yet. But I nodded anyway, turning slowly, walking back to my seat, each step heavier than it should have been, my mind still replaying his words, the way he had said my name, the warning in his voice, the quiet certainty behind everything he did. I sat down, staring at the untouched glass of water in front of me, the condensation sliding slowly down the side, like time stretching in a way that no longer felt normal. I should have left, I knew that, paid the bill, walked out, put distance between myself and whatever this was, but I did not move, because something in me understood, even if I could not explain it yet, that walking away would not mean it was over. Not this time. Not after he looked at me like that. Not after he said my name like it already belonged to his world. I sat there longer than I should have, my fingers lightly tracing the edge of the glass, watching the tiny droplets of condensation gather and fall, each one slower than the last, like time itself had decided to stretch just enough to keep me in that moment. I tried to focus on something normal, the menu, the quiet conversations around me, the soft clink of silverware, but none of it felt the same anymore. Not after the way the room had shifted, not after the way he had said my name like it was already written somewhere I had never seen. I told myself to breathe, slow and steady, to ground myself in something real, but even that felt different, like the air carried something heavier than before, something I could not ignore no matter how hard I tried. And then I felt it again, that same subtle awareness, like being watched without needing to turn around to confirm it. I kept my gaze on the table for a second longer, debating whether to acknowledge it, debating whether looking would somehow make it worse, but curiosity won. It always did. I lifted my eyes just enough, not directly, not obviously, and there he was, still at his table, still composed, still completely in control of everything around him. But his attention was not on his food, not on the people with him. It was on me, steady, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world to observe. And when our eyes met again, he did not look away. He did not pretend. He simply held it, like it was intentional, like it meant something. My breath caught slightly, just for a second, before I forced myself to look down again. But it was too late. The moment had already happened, the kind that does not disappear just because you stop looking at it. I reached for my phone, more out of instinct than purpose, scrolling through nothing, not really seeing the screen, just needing something to hold on to that felt normal, something that belonged to my world, not his. But even that felt fragile now, like a thin barrier that could break at any second. And then a shadow fell across the table, subtle but undeniable. I froze before I even looked up, already knowing, already feeling the shift before confirming it. You stayed, his voice said, low and even, and I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his again, closer now, more defined, the details sharper in a way that made it harder to pretend this was just coincidence. So did you? I replied, the words leaving me before I could overthink them, and something flickered in his expression again. That same almost smile, like he found something in my answer he had not expected but appreciated anyway. He did not sit, did not ask. He simply stood there for a moment, studying me in a way that felt less like curiosity now and more like recognition. as if he was confirming something he had already decided. Most people leave, he said after a second, his tone thoughtful, not judgmental, just observant. Most people do not get involved. I let out a quiet breath, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. Maybe most people are smarter than me, I said, and this time, the faint smile was real, brief, but undeniable. Or maybe they are just more afraid, he replied, and the way he said it did not feel like an insult. It felt like a truth he had seen too many times to question. Silence settled again, but it felt different now, less tense, more focused, like everything else had faded into the background. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me too. Not fear, not exactly, something steadier, something that refused to shrink back just because it would be easier. You never answered my question, I said quietly, holding his gaze, and his head tilted slightly, interest sharpening. Which one? He asked, and I did not look away this time, not even for a second. What kind of problems does this start? I asked, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes searching mine like he was deciding how much truth I was ready for, how much I could handle without stepping back. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, but heavier, carrying something that made my chest tighten without fully understanding why. The kind that does not end just because you walk away, he said, and the words settled between us, quiet but final, like a line drawn in a place I could no longer pretend did not exist. And sitting there, looking at him, I realized something that should have made me leave immediately, something that should have pushed me out the door without looking back, but it did not, because some part of me already knew the truth. I had not just stayed at the table, I had already chosen not to walk away. His words did not leave the air when he finished speaking. They settled, quiet and heavy, like something that did not need to be repeated to be understood, and I felt it in the way my chest tightened again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what he was not saying, the parts he chose to leave unsaid, and somehow those parts felt louder than anything else. I held his gaze, searching for something more, something that would make this simpler, something that would turn this back into a normal conversation between two strangers. But there was nothing simple about him, nothing ordinary about the way he stood there, like the entire room adjusted itself around him without question. Then why warn me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it, because if everything he said was true, if walking away would not change anything, then why give me the chance to be careful at all? His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in irritation, but in thought, like he had not expected that question, or maybe like he had not expected me to ask it out loud. Because you still have a choice, he said after a moment, and something about the way he said choice made it feel less like freedom and more like a line I had not fully seen yet. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head just a fraction. It does not feel like it, I admitted, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression that I could not immediately place, not control, not calculation, something closer to understanding, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that steady composure. That is because you are already thinking about it, he replied, and he was right. I hated that he was right, because the moment he stepped into my night, into my decision, into that single sentence I spoke across the room, everything had started to change in ways I could not ignore. I should have been thinking about leaving, about distance, about putting this behind me, but instead I was standing here, asking questions, staying in a conversation that felt like it had consequences I did not understand yet, and that realization settled deeper than anything else. You make it sound like there is no good outcome, I said quietly, and his gaze held mine for a second longer, steady, unreadable. There rarely is, he answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just honesty delivered in the calmest way possible, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to argue against. Silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, like we had reached a point where something had to shift, where one of us had to step away or step further in, and I could feel the weight of that decision pressing against me. Subtle but undeniable, I glanced toward the door without meaning to. The exit suddenly more noticeable than it had been all night. A clear path back to something familiar, something safe, and for a brief second, I considered it, really considered it. Leaving now? Walking out, letting this be nothing more than a strange story I would tell once and then forget. But when I looked back at him, That option felt less real than it should have, like it belonged to a version of the night that no longer existed. He noticed the glance. Of course he did. Nothing about him suggested he missed details like that, and the corner of his mouth shifted again. That same faint, knowing expression. "You are still here," he said, not as a question, not even as an observation. More like a confirmation of something he had already decided. I swallowed, my fingers relaxing slightly against the table as I straightened just a little, not stepping back, not retreating. "So are you," I replied, and this time, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was deliberate, like we both understood that something had just been acknowledged. Without needing to explain it further, he held my gaze for another second, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable, and yet I did not look away. I could not anymore. And then, slowly, he nodded. Once, like a decision had been made, not by me, but involving me all the same. "Then we will see how far that choice takes you," he said quietly, and the words did not sound like a threat. They did not sound like a promise either. They sounded like something in between, something inevitable. And as he turned, stepping back into his world without looking to see if I would follow, I realized something that settled deep and unshakable in my chest. I was no longer just part of the moment. I had become part of whatever came next. I watched him walk away without turning back, not even once, like he already knew I would still be there, like my presence was no longer something uncertain to him. And that realization stayed with me longer than it should have, longer than made sense. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing just a fraction as the distance between us grew, but the tension did not leave with him. It lingered, woven into the quiet shift of the room, into the way people still moved, more carefully, still spoke with that subtle awareness that something had happened here that did not belong to them. I finally sat back down fully, my hands resting against the table, but nothing felt settled, not my thoughts, not my heartbeat, not even the air around me. I told myself it was over, that whatever this was, it had ended the moment he walked away, but the thought did not hold. It felt fragile, incomplete, like a story cut off before it reached its point. I reached for my water. Again, taking a slow sip just to do something, just to anchor myself in something real, something ordinary. But even that small action felt different now, like I was going through motions that no longer fit the version of the night I was in. "Miss?" A voice broke through my thoughts, and I looked up to see the same waitress standing there again, her posture more steady now, her expression softer. "Your meal. Would you still like to order?" She asked carefully, like she was not sure if I was still part of this place or something else entirely. I hesitated for a second, then nodded, forcing a small smile that felt more real than I expected. "Yes, I think I should," I replied, and as she began to list the specials, I realized how strange it was that life continued, that menus still existed, that dinners still happened even after moments that felt like they should stop everything. I listened, nodded when appropriate, chose something without really thinking about it, and when she left, I let my gaze drift again, not directly, not obviously, but enough to find him. He was back at his table, engaged in a conversation with the men around him, or at least it looked like a conversation, because his posture was relaxed, his movements controlled, but something about it felt distant, like part of his attention was still elsewhere, and I hated that. I wondered if that somewhere was me. I looked away quickly, almost annoyed at myself for the thought, for the way this had already started. To pull at my focus, my control, I should have been done with it, should have finished my meal, paid the bill, and left without looking back. That was the smart choice, the safe one, but instead I sat there, aware of him even when I tried not to be, aware of the way the room still bent slightly around his presence, aware of the quiet certainty that this was not the last time our paths would cross, not because I wanted it to, not because I chose it, but because something about the way he looked at me, the way he said my name, had already set something in motion, and I could feel it now, not loud, not obvious, but steady, like a thread pulling tighter with every second I stayed. My food arrived, placed neatly in front of me, the smell warm, familiar, grounding in a way that almost made me laugh, because nothing about this night felt normal anymore. I picked up my fork, paused for just a second, and then finally took a bite, forcing myself to focus on something simple, something real. But even as I did, even as I told myself this was just another dinner, I knew the truth had already settled in, quiet and undeniable. I had walked into this place expecting nothing, and somehow, without understanding how, I had left that version of myself behind the moment I chose not to look away. I finished the last bite without really tasting it. The motion automatic, mechanical, like my body was trying to convince my mind that everything was still normal, that this was still just dinner, just another night. But the truth sat heavier than anything on the plate, quiet and impossible to ignore. I reached for the check the second it arrived, not hesitating this time, not letting myself drift back into that strange stillness that had settled over the evening. I needed to move, to leave, to create distance before whatever this was could root itself deeper. I placed my card down, my fingers steady now, more certain than they had been all night, because this part, this decision, this was something I still controlled, or at least I needed to believe I did. I did not look toward his table again while I waited, not because I did not want to, but because I knew if I did, I might hesitate. And hesitation felt dangerous now in a way I could not fully explain. The waitress returned. Quickly, her movements more confident than before, her eyes meeting mine with something that felt like gratitude but also understanding, like she knew this night had changed something for both of us. "Thank you again," she said softly as she handed back the receipt, and I gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need more words, because some moments speak for themselves. I signed my name, the ink pressing slightly deeper into the paper than usual, like I was marking something final, something that separated before from after. And then I stood, slowly, deliberately, the chair sliding back with a soft sound that felt louder than it should have. I picked up my coat, slipping it on with practiced ease, grounding myself in the familiar routine, one step, then another, moving toward the door without rushing, without drawing attention, just another person leaving a restaurant after a meal. But it did not feel like that, not really, because every step carried the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been said and everything that had not. I reached the entrance, the cool air from outside brushing faintly against my skin as the door opened ahead of me. And for a moment, I paused, not because I needed to, but because something in me recognized this exact point as a line, a boundary between two versions of the same night. I could walk through and leave it behind, or I could acknowledge that leaving did not mean it was over. And that was the truth that settled quietly in my chest, steady and unshakable. I stepped outside, the city wrapping around me with its usual sounds, distant traffic, faint voices, the rhythm of something bigger than any one moment. And for a second, I let myself breathe, really breathe, the cool air filling my lungs, grounding me in something real again, something mine. I started down the sidewalk, my heels tapping lightly against the pavement, each step creating space, distance, normalcy. But it only lasted a few seconds, because I felt it again. That same awareness, that same quiet shift that had followed me all night, and I slowed, just slightly, not stopping, not turning, but listening, feeling, and then his voice reached me, not loud, not urgent, just there, like it had always been meant to follow me beyond that door. "Emily," he said, and I stopped this time, my breath catching just enough to remind me that nothing about this was finished. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see, already understanding that walking away had never really been an option. He stood a few steps behind me, the streetlight catching just enough of his expression to make it clear that this was not coincidence, not chance. This was intention, and in that moment, standing between the world I knew and the one I had just stepped into, I realized something with complete clarity. I thought I had left the night behind when I walked out that door, but he had followed, and somehow, without asking, without warning, I had brought his world with me.